we know that we're all going to die, and yet we don't learn anything about it until you have to. So why would you not involve this in education when you're growing up? Why would we not get comfortable with it, knowing it's inevitable before we have to? And I feel like
welcome to another episode of the Glam Reaper podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Muldowney, aka the Glam Reaper. And on today's episode, I have my fellow namesake. We have another Jennifer in the building. My gosh. And what I love about this Jennifer is she actually lived for a spell in one of my favorite countries in the world, I would nearly say, definitely in Europe, which is not everybody's favorite. Everyone kind of goes to Italy. I do love Italy, but Germany. I love Germany and I love the Germans, and I actually need to go back. I lived there for a tiny time myself. And here we have on the episode Jennifer. Welcome.
thank you. Thank you for having me.
How are you?
I'm good. Thank you.
Of course. Good. Well, tell us a little bit about you. So you're a licensed funeral director and you were in this business in Germany. So you weren't doing what I was doing, which was just eating all the Nussschneckes and the chocolate milks of the world, spending all the time in the bakeries, or were you?
Yes. So I was doing that as well. There's a grocery store there. I think it's called Vasco, and they have a really nice little bakery. And so I did manage to frequent the bakery. I just now, I think, finally returned to my pre-Germany weight, because when I did get slightly fluffy while I was living there. So yes, I did fall prey to their delicious food.
Which is interesting, because actually a lot of Americans tell me they lose weight when they go to Europe.
Well, there was a lot of walking, in a general sense, but I think that that it was a little different for me personally because I had like a fitness community before I had moved over there that I kind of lost, and so I didn't quite have that over there. I never really quite found that, but I did find the bakery instead, and so there was that, and I indulged a bit more than probably I needed to and wasn't as active as I needed to be. But there was definitely a lot of walking. There are no elevators. The houses have stairs. So it was a good experience. I really enjoyed it. I did. And I think Germany is kind of underrated, because there's a certain authenticity about the people of Germany, that they talk about how like Americans, if you walk by, you smile, or you'll have these conversations with strangers like in an elevator or something that aren't necessarily organic. Whereas if, a German person smiles at you, they authentically want to smile at you. So I feel like it's almost more real. So
It's so true. I find them to be the most helpful people in the world. Like I remember in a similar time, I went to France and I had the same amount of French as I had German. And I tried in both, and the French just wanted nothing to do with me. They laughed at me. Whereas the Germans were like, yeah, like trying to help. And, so I still have a little, I sprechen Sie a bit of Deutsch still. I really have to go back because I think I think once you have a language, I think it's like a muscle in the brain that just has memory. And so it'll bounce back. So hopefully, yeah, I need to go back for an El Nuschnecker. But tell us, what were you doing in Germany?
So, up until July of last year, I was a civilian mortuary officer at the U.S. Army Regional Mortuary, and we served Europe and Africa. So we would serve eligible personnel, active duty, their family members, civilian contractors, and the like, and we would expedite and repatriate them back to the U.S. At the time, we had Armed Forces Medical Examiner presence there as well. So we often performed duties similar to what Doverport Mortuary does in Delaware, only our territory was quite large. We covered all of Europe and Africa, and we handled the logistical movement. So if there was a death in another country, we had to be mindful not only of, the DoD processes and standards and the German laws, but we also had to take into consideration movement wherever the body happened to be and make sure we were abiding by whatever those local processes and documentation and things were. So it was really quite an interesting challenge sometimes because you'd have just this random place in like, Czech Republic or somewhere, and you've got to figure out like the moving parts of getting that decedent into your care and then doing it expeditiously, but also within the constructs of whatever the requirements are. So it was kind of a neat challenge in that it's not something you would encounter day to day over here, I think, in the civilian sector. And I was there for almost 3 years. And that was my second time being a mortician for the Department of Defense. I did serve in the Navy from 2007 to 2012. And during that time, I was active duty. So I entered the Navy at 30 years old. I was the oldest female in boot camp, which was interesting. And put the uniform on, went through boot camp, became a hospital corpsman. And then the Navy is the only branch that has active duty licensed funeral directors and embalmers. And so when you come in, you already have your licensure and that knowledge. So you supplement the hospital corpsman knowledge with that. And that's really where your specialty lies. So that's what I did for a little over 5 years. So I had worn the hat of a Department of Defense mortician, but it's definitely different amongst the branches. I will tell you that the Air Force, the Army, all of that, they're similar but different at the same time. And I was able to kind of see that firsthand as well, working for the Army.
So now, when you were in Germany, were you looking after civilians as well as military, or just military?
No, we took care of civilians as well. So like if it was an active duty member's family member or a retiree, and there are a significant number of retired U.S. service members that married a German and live in Germany. So sometimes we would have them and they would want to be returned back to the U.S. for burial and final placement. So we would have those situations. We would have certain contractors and civilian personnel that were eligible for our services. Sometimes they would have to pay, what our costs would be, but we did take care of people in and out of uniform.
Okay. But only those that were out of uniform, they were still attached to the military in some way, shape, or form.
Correct. Yes, they still had eligibility because, like, if you were over there and you're just like, say, a veteran, like I'm a veteran, I'm not a retiree, and if I had been over there like vacationing or something and died, I wouldn't be eligible for care because I'm not a retiree or in any way linked to have access to care through that mortuary. I have to have care through the German economy, which you can find German funeral homes, especially in the area where our mortuary is very highly populated with Americans. So you can find German funeral homes that are fluent in English and are familiar with the Western ways of doing things and get care in that way as well. Because we also did not do any type of cremation services. So if a person wished to be cremated, then they would need to be cremated locally on the economy with a German funeral home, or we would send full body back to the States in a casket and they could have services and be cremated in the U.S.
Wow. Okay. So quite strict really on what you could cover and what you couldn't. So I mean, I'm not American, but if I was, and I happened to be just holidaying in Germany, it's still, if I died, it would be the contacting consulate and potentially just a funeral home over there, working with a funeral home over here. It wouldn't be anything to do.
Yeah, we did get State Department requests sometimes. And so sometimes it's a matter, you may have a State Department request, there's a connection there. But there's also repatriation companies there that are familiar. The consulate has lists of approved funeral providers that like U.S. citizens can use as well.
Yeah. No, we have a similar vibe over here for the Irish consulate and all that sort of stuff, and very familiar with us, unfortunately. So tell us, you came back, you're from Germany to the U.S.
Yes. So I came back in July, and I had been adjunct teaching for Northeast Texas Community College prior to going to Germany, because I was over there for almost 3 years. And so I had been adjunct teaching in the funeral service education program. When I left, I continued to do that. And then the timing worked out when I returned that they happened to have a full-time instructor opening. And so I was able to become full-time faculty, and I work out of San Antonio. And I also launched my own small business in May of last year. It's called Mulling Mortician. And I provide virtual and on-site training and consulting for funeral professionals. So I basically take their processes, their clientele, and their supplies into context when I'm training with them so that it's applicable to them in a specific sense. I also do general training, and I'm a CE provider. So I'm also a CE provider with the Academy of Professional Funeral Service Practice, the state of Texas, and the state of Florida. So people can get credits as they're training with me. And I tend to be a problem solver, so I can work with directors or embalmers, but I like to kind of help them with just elevating where they are in terms of technique, or if the firm's looking for standardization. I've had advanced training in facial reconstruction and restoration. I was the first American to complete European School of Embalming Skills, and I did that literally the month before I came back. So that was in Belgium, and I did 2 weeks. A very intense reconstruction, and it was fantastic opportunity. I'm so glad I did that before I came back. So I have experience through my career, but also within the context of that advanced training. And then I've trained with Bernie Fountain as well. So I can go into firms and assist them if they have a case that requires some reconstruction restoration. I can assist with that. Or if they just want some training, I can help with that as well. And then, of course, funeral directing.
Great. So tell us, so you're based in Texas, but you also offer the CEs in Florida. What's your, and a CE for anybody who doesn't know is continuing education for a funeral professional, and they have to have certain per year per membership. What is your favorite CE to teach for you personally?
Well, I have one that it's called Sweat the Small Stuff. And I like to do that particular course because it's inclusive of the whole team. And so basically what you're doing is you're kind of breaking down the experience that a client gets when they come into your funeral home. And so it's kind of a reminder of the value of each person's role that they play, whether they're carrying the flowers or cleaning, or they're the administrative side and they're doing documents and programs and things like that. But it's a nice reminder of that collaborative element and how intertwined their roles are. And I like to kind of take a moment with them to explore that and just remind them of that through the process of that training. And I kind of remind them about what it's like to walk into their buildings when you're a consumer of the public versus your day-to-day, because it does look different when you're on the other side of the arrangement table. And so I like to kind of remind them and put them in that vantage point just for perspective. And so they can really see how even the smallest of gestures, the way you pick up behind, a service and clean up, or the way that you hold the door open for someone, the way that you answer the phone, all these small details are a big picture. They contribute to that customer experience. And honestly, I feel like service is the only differentiator really left at this point, because people can get merchandise anywhere. And so it's nice to teach that class and see people kind of reignited with that feeling of empowerment and importance, because I think sometimes people forget how important their role is based on the title. And in the reality of things, all of those pieces and roles are really important. And a funeral director can't do a funeral by themselves. And they really can't. You have to have the drivers.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But yes, we have the title and the license, but we can't do it without the team. And I think that also making people aware and reminding them that when you have a family or a decedent in your care, it's not so-and-so's case, or, oh, that's so, I don't know that, I'm not handling that. It really is more of a team effort. And if you approach your decedents and your cases as ours, I think that what that does too is you get more investment out of people from the leadership perspective. And I feel like we learned that a lot with COVID, because you had people that couldn't come to work for a week at a time unexpectedly. And so you may start with a family, and then you may have to turn it over to someone else without any type of time and expectation of having to do that. And so I think that just reminding people that we share those cases as a team, as a whole, and providing for them. And I think that's really, it's nice to kind of remind people of that and kind of see those things click when they realize how intertwined their roles are. So I really enjoy that particular one.
Yeah. And which do you prefer? Do you work in a funeral home right?
So I do freelance work because I'm doing content creation over the summer for Mulling Mortician, because I have the summers where I'm not teaching. That's usually when I'll start working more diligently on the courses. I have one I'm finishing up and tweaking called Difficult Conversations that I'm presenting in September for the emerging leaders in Texas. And that's going to talk about those instances where you have to maybe describe trauma to a family, or broach subjects that are just really uncomfortable, like when a person is of a size where they're going to require maybe certain types of caskets or equipment, and just how to tactfully and gently have these conversations while preserving the honesty piece. And so I'm available. I have a little reconstruction kit at my house, and I have a little lab here in my house where I experiment with different products and things just to kind of test out different products. I work a lot with Dynair, which is the airbrush cosmetic company, and I've co-branded an airbrush kit with them. And so I actually do a lot of work with the airbrush cosmetic to look at how long it lasts, and just kind of, play with it a little bit, so that when I go to a place and I say, hey, this is capable of doing this, I know I've seen it my own self. And so I also practice my restoration sometimes when I have downtime, because I think if you can hone your skills when they're not in a moment of demand, you have a little bit more of a relaxed way of approaching it, because of the fact you're not like, oh, I got to hurry up, I only have so many hours. And so if you can, it's like sharpening your sword. If you can practice and hone your skills when they're not called upon, you're going to be that much more prepared when you do have to perform. And so I do that sometimes in my downtime too. I do some writing for American Funeral Director as well. I have some articles in there. So I like to stay busy. I read and geek out over all things funeral related. And while I'm not attached to a specific funeral home, I'm available. Like I said, I am dual licensed in Texas or Florida, and I travel. So if a firm needs help, I will fly in or drive in and pretty much help out with whatever that is that they need that I can assist with.
Which do you prefer? Do you prefer front of house or back of house? Back of house being usually stairs or whatever, like embalming and this more scientific.
I think it varies. I think there are times when you like to be in the back of the house because typically when you're providing care to the decedents, when you walk away from that task of embalming, you're done to an extent. And you get the immediate gratification of seeing change from start to finish in that time window. So you're not laying in bed later thinking about it. Whereas when you're funeral directing and you're seeing multiple families, did I call the florist? Did I order the vault? Like, it takes days for those to kind of start to finish. And even then you're done, but you have a relationship with the family. So I think it kind of depends on where I'm at energy wise, because sometimes I like the solitude of embalming because that is more of a one person task. But then I also like the creativity that can come into creating a funeral and experience for a family. So it varies. I like to stay flexible on both sides of things. But if I had to pick one, if it's like I'm on an island and I can only funeral direct or embalm, I would probably pick embalming only because I'm a bit of a nerd, and the capabilities that embalming allow when it comes to just recreating like that natural color and the contours and just that peacefulness that's what kind of drew me in when I was a teenager into funeral service. It was like, I thought that was so powerful, and to be able to not just witness that, but then to be able to orchestrate that is pretty incredible. And to give people the opportunity to like hold their child again, or and I know embalming is not required. However, it is recommended for a lot of different types of services. And I think that it definitely has its place and its value. And I enjoy being able to do that, to be able to kind of restore people back into something peaceful, maybe prior to illness, prior to accident, so that memory picture isn't. Sometimes the family's imagination is worse than the reality. And I think that when you're able to give them something that just soothes them a little bit, even if it's not perfect, it's going to be better than maybe what they've conjured in their mind. And so I think that having that capability is pretty powerful, and there's a lot of responsibility associated with it. So I really enjoy that part of things.
Do you take it, especially for ladies, do you take it all the way through to the end? So for women, like, do you apply makeup? Because I know some people do the embalming, but then they'll have a makeup artist come in and do them.
So I do cosmetics as well. And I, especially with the airbrush, I think it's kind of nice because you can contour and highlight and use light and things as well. And one of the interesting things that I'm trying to kind of help educate people about is the possibility of applying cosmetic to unembalmed people. So if a family's choosing something more like green burial or cremation, or they're not having a public viewing, they don't want a large crowd or a long period of time, but maybe they just need that goodbye moment. I feel like we can be doing the goodbye moment as a profession better. I know that there are some firms that don't want to apply cosmetic because if the person is not embalmed, they worry about contamination or hygiene and things like that. And I think that's where the airbrush can solve that problem, because it does not have contact with skin. It's just literally pushing air and makeup onto skin. And so I feel like we have the possibility as a profession to provide a better goodbye using the airbrush and learning how to use it, learning how to use that makeup. And there's a lot you can do with it in terms of covering. And that's something I feel pretty passionately about, is not just doing the makeup, but really thinking about it beyond just the viewing and burial. Oftentimes there's that link of, oh, they're having a viewing and then burial. They're having a viewing and then, But just because they're not having a public viewing, we can do more than just, close the eyes and mouth and brush their hair. Like we can do a little bit. I think we can do better. And will it take a little bit longer? Yes. But if you can give them a better goodbye, why wouldn't you? And I feel like that's something I'm trying to help educate our profession about. And I feel like airbrush is the answer to that. And it's always been there, but it's not commonly used. And so there's a lack of education and training. And that's where I've created education and training for death care specifically when it comes to application of an airbrush and how to apply that makeup, how to select the makeup, like how to do all those things. And I'm working on that. I have CE approved training on that. I actually go to sites and I set up little easels and actual airbrushes so that the people there can practice in real time with things like saturation, distance, because when you have to do it in a moment and you're not familiar with it, that's when the pressure is on. And that's not the time to grab the airbrush out of your drawer when it's been in there for 5 years. And now you're like, maybe I should try this. And like anything else, the more comfortable you get with your equipment and your supplies, the more deft, at a depth you are going to be at using it. And that's going to give you the confidence and skill that you need. And it's just a matter of learning. And so that's when, like, I made a video I think last week, I was cleaning it and I demonstrated how to clean the airbrush because it's actually quite easy. And I made a remark in there about if you're cleaning your brushes in the funeral home with this much attention, message me because nobody usually does, right? Like you grab a brush and usually it's got color from something else. And you're like, oh no. Or you use a cosmetic brush and the bristles come out. And I don't know if you've ever had this experience on yourself when you're putting makeup on, like with a brush where a bristle's stuck on your face. And nothing is worse than doing intricate work, like with restoration, and then there's a brush hair in it. And you're like, no. And so I think that's one of the nice things about airbrush cosmetic is you don't have to worry about that. And you still have texture. You're not creating a mannequin. You're getting coverage with pores and freckles and the natural flaws that we have. You're not compromising those to create viewability. And I feel like that's something that we really can explore and benefit from.
Well, you and I have talked. I mean, I love makeup. I always have. I worked in makeup when I was younger, and you and I have talked about potentially doing a sort of a day's worth of CE classes together. The Jennifer, the duo effect. And I'm super excited. Like, I'm not a licensed funeral director, but I'm like, I wonder if I could kind of attend the airbrushing because I just am fascinated with it. And I've contrary to popular belief, like just because I'm not a licensed funeral director, I'm not afraid of bodies, and I've been around plenty of them, and I've adjusted where I've needed to do so. And I do actually, I'm going to ask your opinion on this because I would like to become a licensed funeral director. I'm just not of the embalming ilk, as I would say. So if it was sort of dual licensed, where it was front of house and back of house, like which I wish it was, and I think a lot of people would do both, which is fine. I personally would just I'd be a great arranger. But I can't just do that. So it's quite frustrating. What are your thoughts on that? Because I know it's in some states already. It's potentially coming to New York State. I'm actually not sure about Florida.
So Florida, you can be either just an embalmer or both. And then Texas, where I'm also licensed, you can be just the director or both. And I think that because there's inconsistencies with that, what it does is it limits mobility for people. And I think it puts some states at a disadvantage. Because if you only want to be a director and work with people and do the front of the house and you're not interested in embalming, then some states you're not going to be able to easily go and get a license there, right? Because they're going to acquire that embalming element. And I feel like if states would look at these things separately. Now, as a director, yes, it's important to understand the basic mechanics of embalming to be able to speak intelligently and effectively to a family, right? Yeah. But that doesn't mean you need to perform the embalming. And when you're dual licensed as an embalmer and you're only dealing predominantly with the back of the house, then you don't need to know the mechanics of a Catholic funeral or, you know what I mean? So I feel like when they do that combination though, and they don't have options, you're going to potentially find that your state will have less people, less than your workforce, and they're going to attract less people because if people and I think it's so important too to recognize where you fit best. And I think when you know that meeting with families is more of what you are good at and comfortable with, or being in the back and working on care of the decedents is something, it's so important to recognize that and to recognize that in your staff. And I think when a person is more comfortable in one side or the other and they're dual licensed, sometimes you're at a disadvantage because that means that you can be put either or and you get pulled. And I saw this when I worked in Seattle. I worked with a gentleman who he was actually Italian, and Italian was his first language, and he was kind of quiet and reserved, and he didn't like helping so much with like talking to families. And so he preferred to be in the back. And I recognized that in him. And I remember at the time with our firm, with the size of it and the number of families we were serving, I couldn't avoid, because I was managing it at the time, I couldn't avoid him having to kind of work funerals and do these things. Even though he was an embalmer, he didn't really want to do those things. Later, our company was acquired by SCI. And we were part of the Stewart acquisition. And so that was kind of a scary, uncertain time. We were the only firm in Washington State, so we didn't know what was going to happen to us for a while. So you go into work every day, you didn't know, are they going to sell our funeral? Like, what's about to happen to us? And so when we were acquired, one of the nice things was they had a care center. And he was so excited by the idea of being able to work in the care center, where that's all he had to focus on. And when people are where they belong, you see them really thrive, and it's more sustainable. They're going to do a better job. They're going to be more comfortable in their job. And because of the way licensure is structured in some states, it's not going to allow for that. And I think and especially now when there's holes in the workforce and you have a lack of staffing, and that's a real problem in a lot of places, I think it's going to be more of a pronounced problem potentially in those states because of the fact, especially now, I mean, I feel like COVID was, and I know I mentioned COVID before, but it was a pretty significant event and it was relatively recent. And I think during that period of time, people had a wake up of sorts where it's like they started to see like what was important, what wasn't, because people were dying around them. And being unfulfilled in your work is something that I don't think a lot of people will tolerate anymore. And I think that when you're in a role where you're not doing what you feel like you could or should be doing, it's not going to be good for you over the long term. And I feel like that's an opportunity that states, I wish that there was like a licensing blanket. And I know that that's not realistic. I think having a board exam helps because it gives some standardization. And the test scores have gotten better. I know that's been a big complaint about being a barrier to entry, but they have gotten better. The test scores have gotten better. But I feel like it's going to continue to be a problem.
I think there'll be a lot of change in the future. There really, really will. And I think that leads us very nicely to, I wanted to hear your thoughts on the mortician that's out. Obviously, it's scandalous, it's outrageous, it's all of the things. What are your...
So I teach predominantly law, mortuary law. And one of the assignments that I give my students is to identify like a scandal or a case within funeral service, and then they break it down. And that's one that I've seen commonly mentioned by students because it has such a variety of things in it. It's not just like mishandling or misidentification, but that particular instance has so many just abuses of corpse and different things that were happening. And also like the weird side activities, like beating up the competitors and having like football player dudes, like, intimidating people. Like it's almost not even real when you are watching it or hearing about it or reading about it, because it just seems so outrageous and just exaggerated almost. And I feel like it's interesting when we watch these cases because everyone becomes obviously and rightfully like enraged by this, but this went on. And I think it's fascinating when they they interview him, Mr. Sconce, and he says that, everyone's the same when they're cremated. And he says that from a place where I think he authentically believes that. I think he really thinks that even now. And that's even more infuriating. And I feel like, it wasn't just him, it was a series of people. And you'll see that in the show, right? There was a series of people, even, I think it was his mom, or there was the female that was running the funeral home that was also very aware of things. So people were very aware of things prior to it finally getting revealed. And I think it is one of those things where we talk about, if you see something, say something. And I say that. I made a video about that because we've had some bad events in Texas recently at the time that we're recording this. And so it was a matter of, things that are bad it's just like with any type of customer service, right? A complaint is going to get the attention, whereas when things are going well, everything is quiet. And it's like, why aren't we talking more about when things are going well? Like, why aren't we sharing things we're doing in the community? Why aren't we sharing our processes with families? Like, if I had my own crematory and I did all my own work, like, I would make sure families knew that. If I had a third party and I outsourced, I would make sure that I had eyes all over that place, unannounced even. And I feel like sometimes, when we see these things happen and it's like, oh, obviously someone should have said something. But then I also think about the challenge of saying something. And that's a very real thing. And I feel like if you are that person that says, I want you to imagine that you work for David Sconce and you're watching him have football players beat up his competitors, and he has almost a larger than life persona. I think that we need protective measures so that if you do have the courage to say something, you're not fearful of any type of repercussions. Because I know theoretically there's not supposed to be any, right? A whistleblower or a person who says something is supposed to be protected. But the reality is, and you could get blacklisted from being hired. And in that instance, with that particular case in California, because again, it was larger than life, like you had to almost worry about your physical safety. But I feel like in a general sense, if you were to take even a small version of that really outlandish situation and just make a small thing you see in a funeral home, and I say small in comparison to, and I'm saying if you see like a mouse, I feel like, yes, we should be able to say something, but what do you do when the person who's doing it is the owner or the leader? And I feel like that's conversations that we need to kind of have. It's like, yes, we know that, we should say something as a profession. And I will say, like, amongst the cases that have been discussed in Texas, I know one pops into my mind where the staff contacted like the board and like the funeral home itself. When they realized what had happened, they contacted the right authorities when they realized what the employee had done. So they reported it themselves. They did self-reporting, which is good, right? Which is how it should be if you notice something. But I think we need to have conversations to help navigate what you do when it is the owner or it is the leader, or they threaten to pretty much, spread lies about you that can impact you getting a job and things like that. We need better protections for people to feel like they can say something without it damaging their career, or in the case of like that wildness in California, without them having to worry about someone spiking their spaghetti with oleander or whatever that madness was and potentially causing them harm. But yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah, it definitely is. I mean, I've worked in funeral homes and with funeral homes where I have seen that sort of carry on happen and it get reported and then get just dismissed. I've been victim, like I think every woman has, of sexual advances, unwanted sexual advances and stuff like that in this business. Although I will say, I'm saying this business, I do want to preface, and I'm very much, I don't like people, nor do I like to call wolf, in crying wolf in that sense. It happens in every business. I've worked in multiple different industries, marketing, corporate, even back in the makeup days for corporations. And I've worked in bars, restaurants, all across the board. And in every industry, there's some form of predators and there's some form of jackasses, honestly, who will always, they're always in leadership roles. Look at this country right now. They're always in leadership. And it's like, how are they? I actually, I'm not going to name, I probably should, but I'm not going to name the brand, but it disappointed me to no end. And there was a social media post I saw recently where they were talking about their speakers at a recent conference that they threw. It's a relatively small private company, but they threw this conference and every single one of the speakers was a white man over the age of, I would say, 45, 50. I mean, I every single one of the speakers, and I think it's like 10 different speakers. And I was like, and I know there's women in leadership in that company, so I'm not saying that but it was just like, really? Really? There's nobody else we can find. And I'm not saying, because I also, which I've had arguments with my friends over this, is I'm not saying to hire somebody because they're female or because they're black or because they're Indian or because they're Asian or whatever it is, or because they're gay. I'm not saying you hire them because you hire the best person for the job. And maybe in this instance, the best speakers were all men. I mean, I don't know. I certainly didn't get an invitation. You didn't. Maybe we're not good enough. Maybe we don't make the cut. I don't know. But it is very frustrating. And, yeah, I have just seen and experienced it from my own point of view. So I completely get where you're coming from. Mental health is a huge thing I try and help people with, especially women, because that's the area I know. That's my little box. And it's really hard. Yeah. Like if there's somebody who, like, I can only imagine being somebody who worked for that guy, David, and seeing this. I mean, my gut reaction would be just get the hell out of there. Just move on, but then therefore he's getting away with it. Now, I will say, and this is going to be really controversial. I nearly don't want to say it, but I will say that one of the things that interested me or has interested me is how scandalous this is, right? That doesn't shock me, because look at Making of a Murderer and the Menendez brothers, like that. These shows are meant to thrill and excite, and it's like human beings, we love car crash we love car crash TV. So it's like when it comes to the funeral world, it's like when somebody's saying, oh, when somebody died by suicide, the next question you get is, well, what happened? What did they do? And how wrong that is to say that to a grieving family. But yet, and I'm always controversial in my thoughts, but yet I'm like, but why? We always seem to want to know those details. It's like a human thing in us. Like whenever you get in traffic, whenever you get stuck in traffic, nearly 70% of the time, it's because of people rubbernecking. It's because they're literally slowing down to look at the car crash. I don't know what they're hoping to see. It infuriates me so much. I actually make a point of never turning my head and just keep going. But one of the things with the sconce thing in the Lamb Funeral Home, and by no means am I agreeing with him, I want to make that crystal clear, is when he did say about cremating multiple bodies, right? I'm sure he's not the only person who's done that in the world. I'm sure he's not the only person who believes what he believes, in that the person's gone, throw them in, right? We do that to our dogs. Like when my dogs died, you're presented with, do you want a communal cremation or singular, where the ashes you're getting back? I'm not saying it's right, but I think there are certain people out there in the world that do believe once we die, that's it, we're done. Our soul, if they believe in that, our soul is gone. Or they're just atheists and they're like, that's it. I don't need to see the person. I don't want to see them again. They're gone. Now I have to grieve. And these people aren't unhealthy people, by the way, but they do just believe what he believes, which once we're gone, we're gone. And I'm just, rather than going on the defense, which I feel like the whole of the industry is doing, I'm more like, can we pick apart the things that are coming up here? Is there room? And again, I'm not saying it's right, but is there room for communal cremation? Maybe that's something that is offered somewhere in the world, in the country. I don't know, because there are people who can't afford funerals, right? And end up getting in debt because of them, similar to weddings. People go crazy and they get in debt. And, if this was, I don't know. I'm just like, gosh, that's such a fascinating thought process. It is not something I personally would want for anybody I know or love. I think the body is a precious thing. I think a funeral is precious, but a bit similar to what's happening with the conversation of direct cremation. Funeral directors are allergic to direct cremation. They think it's sacrilegious, it's insane, that it doesn't. And yet I'm like, yeah, but maybe that's what people want, and that's okay. If that's what they want, that is okay. We're not all the same. We're not all built the same. We don't all think the same. And maybe they have services in their own way, they have ceremony and ritual in their own way. Well, I don't know. I know this is completely insane, and you're probably like, Jen, absolutely
interesting, though. It's an interesting idea. And I think that, like, when we talk about the body and the value of the body, I feel like the profession, we have to undo things that we have done ourselves. And I think one of it we created the direct cremation idea without properly really exploring options with people. And I think we did that back when we thought cremation wasn't here to stay, which is kind of ironic because the first crematory was built in Pennsylvania in 1898. So it's not like it just started. but there was a resistance there. And I think when you did that, you created a pattern where, oh, they want cremation, so you didn't offer them anything else, right? You didn't offer them supplemental service or explore what an honorable tribute would look like for them. Because like you said, people, it's not always in the chapel. It's not, and I think that when you can explore the essence of who the person was in that family and and really collaborate. And I think that's the thing too, is a funeral director. Yes, we direct things, but it's really collaboration if you're doing it the right way. And so we're having to undo the idea that, direct cremation means that we're not going to memorialize in any way or celebrate the person or just kind of recognize the loss. And so there's that. But when you're talking about the value of the body, it's fascinating because, depending on different cultures and like what you're describing, right? And I think a lot of it's cultural, right? And I think that the idea of it would have to do a lot of times. So like theoretically, let's say that was able to be done. You'd have to find the right equipment for that. And then you'd have to find a company willing to make it. There'd be so many little things. So nobody's going to want to touch that. But like I am a Buddhist faith. No. So everything's transitional, right? In our belief system. And the idea is that, this body's serving me for now. And then whatever happens next. And I try to remind myself, like for me personally, for my family, like I have a certain way I value my body when it comes to that. However, my husband, he's Mexican American. He was raised Catholic originally, and their culture is different. And so he will likely want to do something with my body present when I die. And so I told him whatever. And that's another thing, too, when we talk about like pre-planning is great, pre-need is great. It is, however, you have to remember that it's not for you. It's for the people that are left behind you. And so sometimes I think when we go in with very rigid, structured arrangements that are finely detailed and we've done all the legwork, there's an area there where the family may want to participate or contribute, that we have to make sure we still are preserving space for that. And so like when I talk to my husband or people say, oh, I'm sure your husband knows exactly what you want. I said, honestly, it's not about what I told him. Yes, I'd like to be cremated ultimately. I am a veteran. I am entitled to a space, whatever. But whatever he does before that, I don't know the circumstances of how I will die or how old I'll be or the condition of my body or financially where we'll be. So I don't want to create expectation when I'm not going to be here to like see it through. So I'm kind of fluid with whatever people want to do. And I try to be respectful. Like you said, like with animals, I worked in a shelter and they bag up the dead animals. They go to the landfill or whatever it is, or like communal cremation. Like that was presented to me when my dog died and I made a choice about that. And it wasn't like this atrocious idea. But I wonder if because of history and because of the incidences that we are all aware of that did involve communal cremation when they were done in a horrific way, if that's thrown the idea of it in a dark, bad place. So that even if it were like let's pretend it's the most eco-friendly option that there is, and we could do it, but I'm wondering if it's already been tainted by past experiences where it's been done with ill intent. So I do think it's interesting to explore that.
And that's where it sort of comes into play, is that even when, and as I said, by the way, I'm not condoning anything that he did, because doing anything that isn't in any form of consumer retail, regardless of what the exchange is, if you pay somebody money to do something, that is what you should get, is exactly that, whether it's a cremation or a burial or a dress or a servant, whatever it is, there should be no subterfuge. There should be no sort of underlying criminal activity, like 100% not. But I just think it is interesting, exactly as you said, how we've built, to our own detriment in one sense, the funeral space to be what it is, and the negative impacts. Like one thing I've tried to do over the last 5 years with the Glam Reaper podcast is open up different ideas and what ifs, and it's just about being curious. It's not saying anything's right or anything is wrong. Well, certain things are wrong, but it's more about being curious and leaning into that. Like I know I would get annihilated if I compare certain griefs, and I just personally don't think any griefs should be compared. I personally am a huge fan of pre-planning. But I totally agree with what you're saying, that there sometimes does need to be a little bit of wiggle room. Actually, my favorite thing when I'm doing my pre-planning classes and workshops is hearing back from couples who are like, we had totally different ideas. Oh my God. And the development of that, and actually how much closer it brings them together. But it's just, I always just think it's quite interesting to just be curious rather than immediately going on the defense of things like this show and all that. Is just be curious and sort of see, well, where in God's name did this come from, and this idea, and is there any validation in things at all? And again, not condoning any of it. It's just such a wild show, but I do think there are other people like him out there. And while I do my level best on this show to show the good side of the funeral space, like every industry, like every space, and I know people even hate the word industry, for God's sake, is like, how pedantic can you get? Is there is cowboys, there is jackasses, there is horrible people in every industry. And it's about vetting your funeral home, vetting your funeral director who's taking care of you. And honestly, it's kind of how I even started doing what I do, actually, Jennifer, because way back when I was a wedding planner, and it took sort of two friends of mine dying. My grandmother passed away. We'd lost our dog as well. And I could not believe in Ireland, where we don't actually have licensure and we don't have a board regulating us, we still do okay, but that is another topic for another day. Is that I was like, there is no event, as an event planner, there is no other event in the world that I know of where you would go into the event planners, in this case funeral home, hand over a check. Or at the time I used to say €5,000 because that's what it was in Ireland, but hand over a check, a blank check, really, for and just say, go for it, knock yourself out. There is no other event in the world where you wouldn't be tasting the cake. Now, I know that's a different story, but where you were checking, vetting who the planner was, vetting the venue, vetting whatever, the musicians, all of these different aspects. And yet we do it with funeral homes. And it's just such a fascinating, and again, I was curious. I was like, okay, but why? And can this be different? And how can we do this? Which is how, at the time, I was called Farewell Funeral Planners, how that was born, and then how my book came out. And so I do think it's just always okay to be curious. And it goes back to, again, when the industry started, how we put all the profit money into the casket. And now that's changing. And now we're upset with that. And again, we're, not us particularly, but the industry is on the defense. And, oh, well, now there's direct cremation and nobody wants these caskets. And how are we supposed to make money anymore? Well, I mean, look at what happened with, I'm always getting this confused, but I know Kodak and iPhone is a good example. But like, if you don't evolve, you dissolve.
No, that's true.
I just came up with that. Clearly going to use that one. But if you don't evolve, you're gone. You're toast. It's a very, very, I hope that this show brings, a bit like the death doula trend, which I've talked about before. I hope these things, because they're hitting social media, which is the best way to propel truth and fake news, but it is the best way for discussions to come to the fore. And I really, truly hope that they help evolve the industry into something much better than what it currently is.
And I hope that they provoke conversation. And that's such a void when it comes to education, because we know that we're all going to die, and yet we don't learn anything about it until you have to, right? So why would you not involve this in education when you're growing up? Why would we not get comfortable with it, knowing it's inevitable, before we have to? And I feel like as a result of that, it really puts like us at a disadvantage when it comes to having to make those decisions. And if nothing else, if people watch the show and it makes them have conversations that revolve around death or funeral home selection or anything in that category with each other, because sometimes a couple will assume what the other wants, and then until they have that conversation, then they're like, wait a minute, what? and then they'll put it off, and then it comes to, well, whoever dies first gets to pick or something, the other person gets to pick. And my hope is that at least at a minimum, if it'll at least spur conversations with people, with each other, with their families, and then regulatory agencies. And that's another thing, we pay money for license renewals. Funeral establishments pay money to be properly licensed and registered and all these things. And regulatory agencies are responsible for some degree of oversight. And I think that's been kind of lax in some places too. And I think that's why it's, yes, the California case that happened years ago is in the documentary, but there have been recent events in Texas. And I feel like as a result of that, you're going to see changes within regulatory agencies. And who do you think is going to pay for that? The licensees, more than likely, right? So we're going to probably see, and I'm not psychic by any means, but logically, you're going to see an increase in your costs to renew your license or obtain your license or have your funeral establishment properly licensed and registered and all these things, because they're not like, imagine Texas. You know how big Texas is? It's like you drive through Texas for days, literally. And I drove from Seattle to Florida one time, and I felt like I was in Texas forever. And the only benefit of being in Texas was the speed limit was higher. But I was like, why are we still? It's huge. And when I worked for Wilbert Funeral Services, I was a South Texas marketing manager. I had a third of the state was my territory. And I mean, you would drive through nothingness for the longest. And if you're a little regulatory agency in Austin and you're responsible for this massive state, and there's like, I don't know, a handful of you working there, like you're not gonna be able to pop into places effectively, or, you know what I mean? And so I feel like they're going to have to look at really, and not just Texas, but in a general sense, as these things, especially because the documentary correlate like all these things at the same time. It's like a perfect storm where everyone's going to look over at the regulatory agencies and say, so what are you guys do exactly? And so it's an interesting time where I foresee some changes in that even, which is not a bad thing. And that's where processes and standards and all of that is so important. And I help firms with stuff like that, due diligence and processes and standard operating procedures. That stuff's so important because then it's not subject to change when different people come, right? You have your way of doing things. And I feel like if you work with a third party, if you need to be so careful, because think about if that third party has keys and access to your building and they have employee changes, you don't even know. So you don't even know if they fire or somebody quits and still has keys or access to your codes, right? So you have to be so careful with stuff like that, and exercise that added level of caution when you're dealing with third parties for like cremation or prep care or whatever it is because of that, because you're not going to be privy to their staffing changes and what accesses. When I was leading a funeral home, when I was in Florida, I actually had a couple chapels, a cemetery, a crematory, and every time we had a turnover of a staff person, we changed codes. And so access was always changed. And I feel like, is it, tedious? Yes, but just small things like that even. I think we just need to tighten up a little bit and kind of pay attention.
And that's it. And that's a wonderful end to the episode. Is really and truly, we're ending on I feel like we've come full circle, is basically get your education, higher your standards, don't be the next footage for Max to do a documentary. Do not be that. Exactly. We don't need that. The next one should be more of because we need to replace Sex and the City because that's gone down.
Well, maybe and things like that show. Have you seen that? That's the spinoff. It doesn't have Samantha.
That's like terrible, absolutely terrible. Watch The Mortician instead. But maybe we'll have a Real Housewives of the funeral world or something. There's that would be fascinating. Anyway, Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you all guys all learned a lot, and hopefully we'll hear from you again soon, Jennifer. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed our conversation.